seed among the wheat. Now, what's he talking about here? Well, if you think about it, you should be able to see the parallels between this parable that I just read with the wheat and the tares and the parable of the 10 virgins that we've been going to quite frequently as well. Turn to Matthew 25, and I'm not going to read the entire parable, but I just want to read enough to show you that the same thing is taking place here. Matthew 25, verse 5. While, speaking of the parable of the 10 virgins, while the bridegroom tarried, they all slumbered and slept. I just want to read enough to show you that the same thing is taking place. So we're talking about, we're not talking about the physical act of sleeping here. We are talking about the lowering of your guard, so to speak. They are nodding off, and that is what the word slumbered means here. And if you put it into the context of what is being said here, nodding off is the lowering of your guard and puts you at risk of being deceived. In the parable of the virgins, it says the bridegroom tarried. Or in other words, it seems as if the bridegroom, which is Jesus Christ, was being delayed for some reason. This is one of the responses that I hear most often when I try to take the position that I've taken in this series or have revealed in this series, that we are at the door. And that response is, that I seem to get more than any other, is the Bible thumpers have been saying this for years. Someone is always trying to sell you the idea that Jesus' return is imminent. And people get scared for a moment or two, and they may even repent, and they might get baptized, and they might even start opening up their Bibles and reading it for a short time. But it doesn't take very long before they start getting, if Jesus doesn't come right away, in other words, then it doesn't take very long for them to start getting back to their old ways. And every Christian is guilty of this themselves to some extent. Even me, as I prepare to bring these messages, I'm thinking in the back of my mind, are we really there? Are we really looking at the time of Jesus' return? But the point of this sleeping, the point of them slumbering or they're sleeping, is that what it's talking about is we are becoming complacent because Jesus' return has been delayed or seems as being delayed. Christians have become complacent in their walk of faith. And when we become complacent, our enemy, or the enemy, that is referred to here in this parable and others, is able to come in with seducing doctrines that lead us astray. And that is what the sowing of the bad or evil seed is really representing here. The enemy sows deception in the field. Yeah, and I understand that the seed here is being represented by actual people. And well, that's true. Where deception's coming from. They have to be coming from someone. But it's only because the Christians were slumbering or sleeping that they were able to sow that seed. Now, what I'm saying here is whether we're talking about people or doctrines, it's when we become, as Christians, complacent, is when we are the most vulnerable. All right, so where was I going with all this? Well, we were talking about division that Jesus himself was bringing into the world. He wasn't just going to go along to get along. He was here to set the record straight. And the undeniable fact from his word and from the evidence presented in our daily lives is that division exists. And Jesus' point that if you choose to go along just to get along, then you are more than just asleep. You are in danger of being cast out. That's what the parable's mission or the message in the parables were. And we see that division not only in our family and friends, but in the nation, in the world today. We are more divided now than at any point in my lifetime. And that division cuts right into our very families. And I'm not telling you, and I don't believe that Jesus is saying, put up your dukes and fight these people in the physical sense. But the message he is revealing here is to stand your ground. Hold on fast to what you know is true, and do not let the philosophies of the world weaken your defenses. Is that making that any clearer? And in standing your ground, if that means leaving someone you love behind in the process, well, then that's just what has to happen. Because Jesus makes it clear, if you choose anyone over him, then you lose. He sees this as being unworthy of him, or in other words, or actually his other words, he will declare he never knew you. As I said, I just felt spirit-led to bring that message today because I've noticed that this division is getting deeper and broader with each passing day. Now is the time to be vigilant. Now is the time to stand your ground on what is biblically correct as opposed to what is politically correct. And again, the reason I'm bringing this too is a sign. And that's what we've been studying in this series, is signs that tell us that we're at the door. Now, getting back to where we left off last week, and again, if you remember, I read that passage in Matthew, and I think I'll read it again just to refresh our memory. It was Matthew 19, and we'll drop down to verse 17. And he said unto him, Why callest thou me good? There is none good but one, that is God. But if thou wilt enter into life, keep the commandments. So we see here that Jesus is telling these guys that to enter into life, one must keep the commandments. And I've raised a question, which of the commandments was he talking about? And when he gives the answer, I made the comment that 99% of the Christians is going to totally miss the point. And I actually had a chance to try this out on a Christian this week. I got exactly what I was expecting. Blank stares or generalizations of how or what Christians are supposed to act. But the point is, the Christian, after I recited this passage, could not see the significance in what Christ was saying here. So listen closely to what Jesus says in response to the question, which commandment? Matthew 19, verse 18. He saith unto them, which? Jesus said, Thou shalt do no murder, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness, honor thy father and thy mother, and thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Now, I'm not now, nor do I want to pick on specifically this Christian, because they're not the only ones. It is an epidemic of blindness. But this is what is meant by Christians falling asleep or slumbering, because Jesus is taking his time getting here. Because when we're sleeping, we're not as tuned in. Our defenses are down. And that's when the enemy can come in and slip in and create a deception. And the deception in this case is that Jesus is referring to in the Ten Commandments, that Jesus is referring to the Ten Commandments. They say he has to be referring to the Ten Commandments because Jesus hung all the other laws on the cross. But notice, Jesus didn't read from the commandments here. He also, or just the commandments, he also read from the law. You didn't see it? Well, it was the very last thing he said in the passage. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. And that is what 99% of the Christians will miss when reading this statement by Christ. Now, the double witness to this comes a couple chapters later in Matthew 22. We'll pick it up at verse 35. Then one of them, which was a lawyer, asked him a question, tempting him, saying, Master, which is the great commandment in the law? Jesus said unto him, Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, and with all thy mind. This is the first and great commandment. The second is like unto it. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Now listen to what he says here. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Now, in this particular case, Jesus is only reciting two commandments. Thou shalt love thy Lord thy God, and thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. But what I want you to see or understand here is he's calling both commandments, but only one of them is found in the 10 Commandments. And the problem is that people don't understand what the word commandment means. A command is something that has been given as a directive. And a directive is something that is to be obeyed. So when Jesus includes this thought or precept that originates from the Old Testament laws and calls both of these things a commandment, he is telling us that both are a directive that need to be obeyed. Because he says, upon these two commandments or directives hang all the law and the prophets. Meaning, if you interpret the laws correctly, they will teach you how to love your God and how to love thy neighbor as thyself. Because the church teaches that these laws have been done away with, it also indicates that you cannot know or learn how to love thy God with all your heart. Nor can you know or understand how to love thy neighbor as thyself. Additionally, you cannot know what the will of God is, which is why we came to these verses in the first place. You see, we come full circle back to the point of what is the will of God. Now, if you remember from last week, we were instructed, if you love me, keep my commandments. I want to go back to Matthew 24, where this study began, and continue there, because we only made it so far about halfway through this chapter. We left off with reading of verse 8. It states that all the previous signs that Jesus gave the apostles here were just the beginning of sorrows or troubles. Matthew 24, verse 9. Then shall they deliver you up to be afflicted, and shall kill you, and you shall be hated of all nations for my name's sake. Now, I suppose this is about a hard concept to convince Christians today as well. That there are those out there that hate us. It doesn't matter how much you preach to them, how much you love them, how much you show them mercy. They are going to hate you. Not just in other nations, but in this nation. And since it is the plan of our enemies to bring all these other nations into this nation and call it immigration instead of what it really is, an invasion by foreign combatants, we are becoming more and more hated in this country as well. And if you can't see this already happening, then you're not just asleep, you're comatose. Now, this passage can manifest itself in many different ways, and it doesn't necessarily mean to round you up and throw you in jail or put you on some kind of tribunal to receive some kind of punishment. It can also mean that the people that hate us will get into in places of power over us, such as in the government, such as in the judicial system, and so on. The schools, churches. And with their laws, their doctrines, and judgments, they can afflict us and reduce our freedoms, our rights, and so on. In fact, that's exactly what they've done. And they defend what they're doing by calling it justice for the downtrodden. Putting Christians who settled and made this country the greatest nation on earth in the category of religious bigotry. Isn't that afflicting us? And the second part of this passage can only be speaking of Christians, because only Christians can be hated for his name's sake. So it is a Christian nation that will be experiencing this hatred. And yet it's the Christians that are being accused of being the haters, especially the type of Christians such as I am that take this type of position. Where is the love? Well, my love is towards God and his will. And in the very next verse, we get back to this division thing again. Matthew 24:10. And then many shall be offended, and shall betray one another, and shall hate one another. So when this enemy, and again, I need to clarify the point that we indeed have enemies ruling over us. So when this enemy starts to afflict us with their form of justice, the type of justice that robs and plunders Christians in favor of these immigrants, many will be offended. Or in other words, they will reject your Christian position, and they will actually take the side of the conspirators and become co-conspirators. That's what's meant by betraying one another, or at least one of the ways. Take a look at what's going on in our political arena today. Again, if you can't see the divide in today's political atmosphere, you are more than just asleep. Just like I said a moment ago, you have to be comatose not to see it. We have no idea how deep the treason has gone in this country. On both sides of the political aisle. I don't care if you're Democrat or Republican, conservative or liberal. We have yet to find the true depth of the deep state's treason against this country. I think it'll become more and more obvious the closer we get to that actual door day. The day when the door is open and we are waved to come on in if you are found doing the will of God. Matthew 24, verse 11. And many false prophets shall arise and shall deceive many. Now, we've covered this before, even in our introductory message. But this is one of the problems that is probably the most subtle of all the signs that we've been given. Now, and one of the ways that this is being secretly revealed, I should say, I'll try to, because most Christians will find these statistics that I'm going to read here absolutely shocking. For instance, the following is a list of the percentage of ministers that Pew is a research fund along many different lines, but a lot of times religious. This is the percentage of ministers that do not believe in the virgin birth of Christ. Lutherans, 19% of their ministers do not believe in the virgin birth of Christ. Baptists, American Baptists, I should specify, both Lutherans and Baptists are American Baptists and Lutherans. American Baptists, 34% of the ministers don't believe in the virgin birth of Christ. Episcopalians, 44%. Presbyterians, 49%. Methodists, the religion that I was brought up as a child in, 60% of the ministers do not believe in what is the fundamental doctrine of Christianity. And if you try to tell one of those Christians that attend one of those churches and give this back to them, they will deny it, either outright or accuse you of being a false prophet trying to divide the church or some other silly accusation like that. You see, they don't want to believe it. They are asleep. They got their heads in the sand because they want to have this white picket fence around their world. Well, it might be white on your side of the fence, but there's somebody else out there throwing mud on the other side. And that's not all. It gets even worse. This same poll says the same ministers that do not believe in Jesus's virgin birth also do not believe in the physical resurrection of Jesus Christ. Again, American Lutherans, 13% of the ministers do not believe in the physical resurrection of Jesus Christ. 33% of American Baptists, same thing. Episcopalians, 35%. Presbyterians, 30%. Methodists, again, lead the pack. 51% of their ministers do not believe in the physical resurrection of Jesus Christ. Another foundational truth of Christianity. Ladies and gentlemen, it doesn't get any more clear than this. If Jesus Christ did not resurrect from the ground, then Jesus Christ is not God, and Christianity is a false religion. And we have across-the-board denial of the two main tenets of Christianity being denied by the ministers who teach Christianity. Now, how much truth do you think that these ministers are going to give their congregations? How much truth do you think they can give their congregations, knowing what they believe? Continue on verse 12 of Matthew 24. And because iniquity shall abound, the love of many shall wax cold. And I want Christians today that believe that God has put the laws on the cross and we are no longer to follow them, to think about this verse right here. Because iniquity abounds. The word iniquity, as most of you know here in this congregation, is an old English word that just simply means sin. And we know the biblical definition, as Jeffrey said today in communion message, that sin is the transgression of God's law. And he read it, and I'll read it again. 1 John 3:4. Whosoever committeth sin transgresses also the law, for sin is transgression of the law. Now, and it's interesting that you brought up that situation where you were talking to a woman, I guess, and I have done the same thing. It's amazing how many people will stumble or start stuttering when you ask them what the biblical definition of sin is. Even ministers. They will give you all manner of vague answers. Well, sin is just doing something that's bad. Or sin is something that God disapproves of. And I actually find it quite amusing to do this for no other reason, just to watch them stutter. Because these Christians love to boast of how much they go to church or some other church-like activity or how pious they are, and then they can't even define what sin is from a biblical definition. But the Greek word translated iniquity here is anomia, and the word actually means violation of law. So when Jesus makes a statement like, when iniquity shall abound, what he is really saying is, when we are openly rebellious to his laws, statutes, and judgments. And this is the context of the word abound. But when we see that happening, love shall wax cold. And in other words, we will lose our ability to love in the proper sense of the word. We will lose our ability to love one another, and we will definitely lose our ability to love God as we should. And isn't it strange that the one thing that was designed to show us how to love one another is the first thing that the church throws out the window? Now, Trish and I like to watch mystery movies and cop shows, and what is it that just drives an investigator crazy? This interaction time. What just drives someone who is investigating something crazy? Any ideas? Coincidences. Investigators hate them. They even tell you that in the shows. Because they usually find out through the course of the show or the course of their investigation that there are no real coincidences. Now, coincidences happen for sure, but they are also the very first thing that you should be investigating to rule out when you come across them as a coincidence. Now, what I'm suggesting here is, if you haven't figured it out yet, is do you think it is just a coincidence that the very first thing that God gave us to demonstrate or to illustrate, or in other words, teach us how to love in the proper context of the word, is the very first thing that the church tells us we don't have to obey? What are the odds? And as Q frequently asks in his posts, do you believe in coincidences? And if you don't know who Q is, then you really need to find a source that follows the Q postings. And I use the forum called Just Informed Talk, because he's made it his business to follow, investigate, and to document everything and anything Q. He also, or he is, or claims to be a Christian, and I have no reason to doubt that he is. And I will say this, though. He is a fundamentalist Christian. You can tell it by the way he talks about the things that he says. So he wouldn't be a supporter of this minister or anything that I preach. I'm just saying to be aware of the bias that he uses or the way he thinks, but I think he does otherwise a very good job in tracking down all this stuff.